With New Orleans Saints quarterback Derek Carr in concussion protocol for the second time in a month, Jameis Winston should be the starter for the New Orleans Saints Week 14. We got all that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? Welcome in to another episode of Locked On Saints, your daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you, as always, to all you everydayers out there making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget, you can subscribe and follow always for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss the latest episodes. And if you want to keep the conversation going, take part in our exclusive film studies, Q&As, and much more, you can become a Locked On Saints insider today by simply texting Who Dat to 504-285-7473. I am your host, Ross Jackson, at Ross Jackson Nola on your favorite social media, your New Orleans Saints expert, credentialed member of the media, Saints News Network, Tuesdays in the Locked On NFL podcast, and here with you every single Monday through Friday on Locked On Saints. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by friends at GameTime. Download the GameTime app, create an account, and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off of your first purchase. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. On today's episode of Locked On Saints, it's our Monday show, continuing to recap what was a disappointing loss, but a good fight shown by the New Orleans Saints up against the Detroit Lions. We're going to take a look at what we didn't like, what we did like. So we'll take a look at why the Saints decided to go away from the run game while they were still in it again for some reason. We're also going to take a look at how the Saints stars played well. So a little bit about what we liked, what we didn't like. And then to kick us all off, just an update for you on Derek Carr's status. So here's my take on the Derek Carr situation right now. And I want to be very clear. This does not have anything to do with his performance. At one point, he completed 15 consecutive passes up against the Detroit Lions. Yes, he had the early interception in a pass that was well placed, but bounced off the hands of Juwan Johnson, not necessarily on him. James Hurst runs into a football as it's being snapped. That ends up causing a fumble, all these other things. I thought that Derek Carr performed well, and of course, did a very good job bringing the Saints back in that game, keeping everybody there, making the passes, doing the things that they needed to do to be able to get back into the game. Now, I give a lot of credit to Alvin Kamara, a lot of credit to Taysom Hill, a lot of credit to Derek Carr, a lot of credit to Chris Olave for getting all that done. However, Derek Carr should not be the starter for the Week 14 game against the Carolina Panthers. And it has nothing to do with his health, nothing to do with his talent or with his ability, has everything instead to do with his health. 2 concussions in the matter of a month for a guy that effectively played his entire career like without a concussion ever. That's scary, man. And so I just don't see a Carolina Panthers team that's 1-11, has a rookie quarterback that's still very much struggling to get his legs under him, that's undersized and probably isn't going to pan out in the NFL, that a team that doesn't have a head coach, a team that's in turmoil. Why rush Derek Carr back to go up against a team that effectively is about to give you perhaps your most winnable game of the year? It doesn't make enough sense to me to risk that. And again, a lot of people heard me say this in the post-game live show and thought that I was sort of saying that Derek Carr was the reason that the Saints lost to the Detroit Lions. Never said that. Never made any impression that that was my thought process. The reason why I'm talking about him not starting this upcoming weekend against the Carolina Panthers is because you don't need to rush him back from this concussion protocol. Now, because this is his second concussion, it doesn't change the steps of concussion protocol, but might make the independent neurological consultant a little bit more kind of dicey about progressing through the final part of the concussion protocol if Derek Carr makes it that far at this time. But he's also being evaluated for a rib injury, was noted to have a shoulder injury. Seems that the shoulder has checked out okay, is what Dennis Allen told us earlier today. So now what you're looking at is a potential rib injury with a guy landing right on top of him. And then, of course, also the concussion protocol. I just don't see a reason to put this guy's personal health aside for the chance to beat a 1-11 team. If you can't go out there and beat a 1-11 team with a guy that has been your starting quarterback before, you don't deserve to win the game anyway. It's that simple. if your defense can't go out there and win you this game, you don't deserve to win the game anyway. There's no reason to rush Derek Carr back for this. Let him wait. Let him do the last game of the homestand up against the New York Giants and on throughout the rest of the season. But there's no reason to rush him back in order to be ready for this game. And no reason for him to rush back to be ready for this game outside of just like the personal pride of like wanting to play football. I get it, but it just doesn't seem necessary, right? Like, can we all agree this is a winnable game for the New Orleans Saints? Can we all agree this is a winnable game for the New Orleans Saints, regardless of who's under center, and that maybe just a heavy lean on Alvin Kamara and Taysom Hill is really all that this one's going to take? And then finding ways to connect with Chris Olave when the run game opens up the passing game. Like, isn't this simple enough that you don't have to do something like that? I certainly think so. And maybe some people disagree with me. That's okay. But I think that Derek Carr should effectively be given 2 weeks to come back from concussion protocol. He might not have a choice. We'll see how quickly he progresses through protocol. We'll see what happens with the rib injury. But it just seems a little bit unnecessary to rush back for this upcoming game against the Carolina Panthers. So can the New Orleans Saints win with Jameis Winston? Absolutely. Absolutely you can. This is not a good pass defense, the Carolina Panthers. This is a defense that you should be able to run the football against as well to mitigate maybe if there is some of the concern around turnover proneness. Sure, whatever. You can mitigate all of it. You can navigate all that. It makes perfect sense. There's no reason to rush Derek Carr back for this game against the Carolina Panthers. If you continue to build out your team, you continue to build out your offensive approach through Alvin Kamara and Taysom Hill, if the defense does what it needs to do at the very beginning of the game, as opposed to kind of figuring out what the offense is trying to do a couple of drives in and then adjusting to it, this is going to be a Carolina Panthers team that they've faced, that they're familiar with. It's going to be very different, sure, but not vastly different, right? So it's a bit of a different circumstance than going up against a more unfamiliar opponent like the Detroit Lions. You should be able to come out here and get a fast start against the Carolina Panthers. If not, that doesn't mean that has nothing to do with who's under center. That would, again, be a coaching issue, right? And that would have happened whether Derek Carr is under center or whatever, because we're talking about the defense here, right? So the defense should be able to keep you into the game. You've got the weapons, you've got the stars where you need them. That can end up helping you navigate this game. Maybe Rashid Shaheed's back next week. That could be helpful from a special teams perspective as well. Get some favorable field position starts, things like that. It's just not necessary. Not necessary at this time to rush Derek Carr back. But we'll see. We'll see. Maybe he clears concussion protocol. Maybe the ribs check out perfectly fine and he's all good to go. But if there's any question mark, like if it's not 100% sure, if you're 99% sure, then you're 100% unsure in a situation like this. And the stars on offense are a big reason why I feel comfortable about the New Orleans Saints moving forward for this coming week for the betterment of the health of Derek Carr with Jameis Winston as their starter, because what we saw against the Detroit Lions were the stars stepping up and playing well. Alvin Kamara, Taysom Hill, Chris Olave. Let's highlight their days as a part of what we liked from the New Orleans Saints offense as we continue on with today's episode, or the New Orleans Saints team in this loss to the Detroit Lions, as we continue on with this episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is sponsored by BetterHelp. BetterHelp Therapy Online is awesome, and it's been very, very important for me. I've been very open about seeking therapy, utilizing therapy, and how much it's benefited me. And I think that it can have a massive impact. I grew up in sort of an environment where you never talked about therapy. If you did talk about therapy, you were weak, all these other things. That's not the case today. I think we have a much better understanding of the values of therapy and the values of something like BetterHelp, which makes therapy a little bit more accessible, right? Especially if you're somebody that, doesn't want to deal with the traffic, can't deal with the traffic, live too far away from like your nearest mental health centers and stuff like that. BetterHelp, from the comfort of your own home, on your laptop, on your phone, whatever it is, you're able to get access to a licensed therapist who will be specifically picked for you based on questions that you answer in your questionnaire. And don't worry, if they're not a good fit, it's free to change as well, removing all the barriers to access and also removing some of the other bureaucratic stuff you have to deal with. If somebody's not a good fit for you, you can trust yourself, and BetterHelp will trust you back. So in a season of giving, give yourself what you need with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon today to save 10% on your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. All right, family, continuing on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. Thanks again to all the everydayers out there making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget to go and check out the Locked On Sports Today 24/7 stream on YouTube. YouTube's first and only national sports 24/7 stream brought to you right here by Locked On. Make sure you're going to check them out. Be a part of history. On today's episode, we're going to take a look at the good and the bad, like what we liked, what we didn't like from the Sunday game against the Detroit Lions. And to start us off in terms of what we liked, I want to start with the stars, right? Alvin Kamara, Taysom Hill, Chris Olave on the offensive side. These are guys that needed to have big games, that needed to be called upon and trusted by the offense. And they found ways to do that. Alvin Kamara putting together a really, really nice game in this one, ends up with 59 rushing yards, ends up contributing on the offensive side of the football, or excuse me, in the receiving area as well with another 58 yards. Excuse me, he rushed for 51 yards. My apologies. But then also had 58 yards receiving. So he goes over 100 yards from scrimmage in this game. He also overtook with his 2 rushing touchdowns Mark Ingram for the all-time rushing touchdowns leader, franchise record for the New Orleans Saints, and overtook Marcus Colston for the yards from scrimmage, all-time yards from scrimmage leader as well. But I think that the stars of this game made it possible for the New Orleans Saints to claw and scratch and fight their way back. Derek Carr being one of them as well. 15 consecutive passes completed at one point continued to help to get the Saints involved and back into the game. So I think that Alvin Kamara, Derek Carr, Taysom Hill, particularly in his usage in the red zone, and doing things that I think the Saints offensive line are more comfortable with. I think what we're seeing right now is that you'll notice that blocking for Alvin Kamara, the offensive line tends to be pretty unsuccessful, right? Particularly up the middle. But then blocking for Taysom Hill, they seem to be very successful. And I think that there's something just about what that scheme or philosophy is, because when you're blocking for Alvin Kamara on the inside, oftentimes it's an inside zone. So what you're doing is that everybody's taking that read step. It's a zone block. So instead of you blocking the guy directly in front of you, you're blocking the gap that you're responsible for. And so you're trying to move to that gap, block that gap, and then open things up. Doesn't seem to be very successful. When it came to Alvin Kamara in this game and the zone run, actually not just Alvin Kamara as a whole, but the zone run as a whole, only 3 yards per carry and only a 41.2% success rate when it comes to that. One of the lowest in the NFL this week. Not by far, not the lowest, because the lowest was actually the Los Angeles Rams, 28.6% success rate. So still vastly more successful than anything Los Angeles was able to do in that area of the game, but still one of the least successful ones. But then what we saw was the man or gap concept, which is a little bit more like go over there and block the guy in front of you, punch them in the mouth. They performed extremely well. They were averaging 4.3 yards per carry in that scheme, to a 68.8% success rate. So a big time leap and step forward in terms of man blocking, which is block the guy in front of you, versus zone blocking, which makes the offensive line or the protection responsible for a gap instead. And so I just wonder if maybe like that's something that you look at and you go, okay, maybe that's where the New Orleans Saints can also find their identity in the run game, which they've struggled to do so far. When you run inside, man gap scheme, punch the other team in the mouth. When you run to the outside, then maybe that's a time to where you're able to utilize some of these zone blocking concepts and all of that. Alvin Kamara, 3 missed tackles forced in this game and had those 51 rushing yards with a long of just 16. So he was consistently churning and picking up yards. And then 3.14 yards after contact per attempt. That's up from around 1, which is what we've seen so far for him this season. And then Taysom Hill, right? Taysom Hill, the other star that absolutely performed well. What he was able to do, of course, in the run game and the man blocking scheme, which I think gives that team a lot of confidence, right? It makes you feel a lot more confident to go into a run game scenario and just out bully the big ugly guys in front of you. Then to kind of like win with finesse, right? Like that gives you a lot of confidence in that way. And so I think that that's something that is beneficial for this New Orleans Saints offensive line, particularly when running in between the tackles, is to have sort of that gap or man scheme at their disposal. And I think with Taysom Hill, they've found ways to find that. Taysom also had 2 catches for 15 yards, a long of 18. So the other was a loss of 3 yards. So not so great there, but still helping from all the different areas of the field, as we so often have seen when it comes to Taysom. So I think that, like, if you're looking for somebody on the offensive side, if you're looking and going, okay, so who on the offensive side is going to help this offense get back on track or find their new direction or get on track, whatever it is, you have to look at the biggest names. And the biggest names from the non-offensive line position in this game were the Taysom Hill, the Alvin Kamara's, the Chris Olave, Derek Carr, Jimmy Graham, who caught a touchdown in this game, only played 2 snaps, caught a touchdown on one of those snaps, his very first one, on a nice route that he ran as well. I just think that, like, there's value there in terms of seeing those stars come up and help you claw, scratch, and fight your way back. Not a star, but something else that we really like is Nephi Sewell. Nephi Sewell having to step in this game in place of the injured Pete Werner. 8 total tackles, including 2 tackles for a loss. Never really seemed lost in and of itself. I thought that he had himself a pretty nice day in this one. So that was another one that you look at and you go, okay, there's another young piece to this offense, or to this defense rather, that maybe gives you a little bit of a glimmer of hope in terms of what this team can look like on the defensive side, even if it loses some of its veterans. And there's a lot of veterans in that, on that New Orleans Saints defense that we'll see if they stick around beyond this season. Could be an eventful offseason from that area, but seeing like young guys like Nephi Sewell step up the way that he did, I think that that's encouraging for you for sure. And then the last kind of big positive thing that I want to mention that we really liked from this game, the fight. I mean, look, you can either choose to put your stock in a 21-point deficit as it opened up, which is warranted, which is valid, or you're going to want to put your stock in clawing, scratching, fighting their way back, which is also warranted, also valid. I don't think either of them is wrong. I think in either case, you have to at least acknowledge the other, no matter what side of it you're on. But it's okay if you put more stock in the 21-point deficit. We're going to talk about that here in just a little bit. But I also understand putting stock in clawing, scratching, fighting your way back. You know, there's a lot of times where we have seen this team, and this happens with losing teams. This isn't unique to the New Orleans Saints. This isn't unique to the New Orleans Saints fan base. This is, every fan base does this anytime that a team is losing. The ex players have given up, right? Or the team has given up, or the team is playing like they don't care, or whatever it might be. I think that what the Saints showed you in this game is that that's not the case. You could make the argument that maybe they, that I've seen people making the argument that, they started off slow because they had already given up, then they sort of felt the charge to work their way back in there because they didn't want to lose by that much. I think that's a little bit of a stretch for me. I think you walk into every game hoping that you're going to compete, wanting to compete, and then sometimes you get punched in the throat and you got to find a way to claw your way back. And I think the New Orleans Saints did that. So I'm glad to see a game like this, even though it didn't result in a win. And by the end of the season, there's not going to be any value to place in all of this. But I think for right now, in terms of where you are with 5 games ahead of you, you love seeing the fight. And I think it's something that should be commended because a lot of teams would have just rolled over down 21-0 with like 7 minutes out of the game, right? 7 minutes into the game, they were down 21-0. Easy to roll over at that point. Easy to see that game finishing like 42-10. Instead, they held them to 13 points in the second half or whatever it was. And then, scored 28 points before the game was over. So kudos on the fight for the New Orleans Saints. The good that we did see was not enough to outweigh what we didn't like. So what we liked was great. What we didn't like had even more of an impact, including why do the New Orleans Saints continue to go away from the run game when there's absolutely no reason to do so? We got that coming up for you as we continue on and wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends at GameTime. Download the GameTime app, and that is absolutely the only thing that you need when it comes to getting tickets for your favorite events, sports, whether it's NFL, you want to go and see a Saints game, maybe you want to go and see a Pelicans game here in New Orleans, maybe you're outside of the state, you want to go see something else, maybe you're in Dallas, you want to go see a Stars game or an Astros game, something like that. There's a ton of different things, including comedy, theater, and music, and much more that you can check out on the GameTime app today. And it's awesome to let you actually see the view from the seats before you even purchase the tickets. The game time guarantee means that if you buy tickets from Game Time and then on another site you find tickets in the same row and same section for cheaper, they will actually give you back 110% of the difference. That's how confident they are. So take all the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time today. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off of your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. Wrapping up today's episode of Locked On Saints with a look at the things that we didn't like from the New Orleans Saints loss to the Detroit Lions, aside from the score, of course, and the loss itself, but a little bit more of the elements of what made that loss up. Starting off with, again, play calling. Appreciate all you everydayers out there making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day, every day. Look, I know that maybe it's a little bit of a dead horse to continue to talk about here. I know that it's something that maybe some people have kind of gotten over. I haven't. I'm still very critical of the New Orleans Saints play calling. And what it has sort of turned into over the course of the past couple of weeks is actually like fine play calling between the 20s, meltdowns in the red zone, as we know, although red zone offense went really well in this game against the Detroit Lions, something else I probably should have included in the what we liked part of that. They did go 4-4 in the red zone, so kudos there. But one of the things that I haven't liked here recently is how quickly the Saints abandoned the run game, even though they're still in games. Against the Minnesota Vikings, they had this whole sort of like company line around being in an obvious passing situation. 3 minutes left, down 8. No, you're not. I mean, simply wrong, right? Like, that's not really what that was. You just kind of got away from the run game and started airing out passes and kind of reverting to what it is that you felt most sort of comfortable with in just like the weirdest way possible. And then now this week against the Detroit Lions, down 5, driving 2nd and 6, 3rd and 6, 4th and 6, pass, even though the run game, as we highlighted earlier, was actually working for you, especially the Taysom Hill game plan, where maybe on 2nd and 6, you run and gain 3 yards, but then it's a 3rd and 3, and then maybe you run again and you got a first down, and all of a sudden you're driving. Like, you had that type of situation to where you had the ability to manage the clock in your favor. And again, just the wrong decision of getting away from the run game a little bit too quickly. So this is why I'm still very critical of play calling for the New Orleans Saints, and why I still think there's a massive change that needs to happen there over the course of this offseason. That just feels like it's something that has kind of come back to bite them in the butt in a couple of these single score games where they were still kind of in it, but then abandoned what worked in favor of lower percentage situations, which anytime you're putting the ball in the air versus keeping the ball on the ground, you're in a lower percentage situation. And so I don't get it. I don't understand why we have seen this now in 2 of the last 3 games. The Saints very well in control of their ability to be able to drive down and tie in case of the Minnesota Vikings game, or take the lead in the case of this Detroit Lions game, and just abandon the run game at like the worst possible time. So I think that that's something that I did not like at all from this New Orleans Saints team. Another one is just not being ready to start again. Colin Saunders, I think, gave a really honest explanation of earlier preparation needing to be done, which kind of, I don't know if he intended it to be this way, and I'm not going to put words in Colin Saunders' mouth at all, but I am going to say that for me, that initial statement, right, without the context and knowledge of everything that's going on, right, because even the media viewing window, we only get to see 20 minutes of practice. So I don't want to try to, prescribe blame where there doesn't need to be blame. There's already enough to go around. We don't need to create a false narrative here. But it is interesting in terms of how that sounds like the team comes into games a little bit unprepared. And is that a practice question, right? Scouting the team and learning a little bit more about what it is that they do, and then having that understanding during practice and then leading into a game, as opposed to having to scout it out during the game. Like, yeah, one of those sounds a lot better than the other. And one of them sounds like it shouldn't be happening in the first place. And so for me, like, that creates a big old level of concern in terms of the continued question marks that are going to swirl for the last 5 games of the season around the coaching staff. Less than ideal to have those types of questions circulating in December around your team. So that's another thing that we didn't like from this game. And one last thing that we didn't like from the loss to the Detroit Lions, Derek Carr took 24 dropbacks in this game and experienced pressure on half of them, exactly half. 12 plays without pressure, 12 plays with pressure or under pressure. That's not a very good stat for any quarterback to have to endure. Now, he still operated very well in both of those occasions. He had a passer rating of 105.9 when he wasn't pressured, of 90.8 when he was pressured. But that's not always going to be the case, right? Like if you're allowing that much pressure 50% of the time, you're not always going to get the quarterback that comes out there and, operates pretty well under pressure. So just something to maybe keep an eye out on. Again, I think that we have seen sort of this offensive line hold steady in terms of how much pressure it has allowed in games. And that's made it look like it's gotten better because Derek Carr has gotten better at avoiding the sacks, not taking the sacks, things like that. We've seen the pressure rate stay consistent. We've seen the pressure to sack rate drop. And some of that is more about Derek Carr's play than the offensive line's play. And so therefore, I haven't really bought into maybe some others that are kind of talking about how much the offensive line has improved. I'm not really there yet. And this to me was indicative of that. The other thing, going back to play calling for just a moment, 4 plays of play action called in this game. Whatever it is that Pete Carmichael doesn't like about play action, I'll never understand. I don't get it. And we can't get anybody to explain what's the downside of play action. There is an inherent downside of turning your back to a defense and having to come up and see it. But Derek Carr's been in the NFL. This is his 10th year now. He's good at play action. Like it was one of the things that when the Saints signed him, that we kind of pinpointed and said, okay, this is one of those things that they want to incorporate more in their offense. So they went and got themselves a quarterback that is good in that situation with play action. And then we just haven't really seen it. So there's a couple of little things there from the passing side that still, create some concern, whether it's from the play calling or schematic side of it or the execution side of it. Still some concerns there for sure. So a little bit about what we didn't like, a little bit about what we liked, as well as an update on Derek Carr, what I think things are going to look like going into week 14. We'll have a better understanding of Derek Carr's progress throughout concussion protocol beginning on Wednesday, which is when we're back at practice to see the Saints. So we'll continue to keep you up to date for that. But you won't have to wait until then. We'll have another episode tomorrow morning on Tuesday, getting you all caught up and kind of looking at the X's and O's around the New Orleans Saints. How did the Saints utilize Alvin Kamara? And can they replicate that moving forward? And even for you, some of the things that they should be still adding to Alvin Kamara's game plan that we haven't seen very much yet this season. We got that coming up for you in tomorrow's episode. I appreciate you as always for all you everydayers out there making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. And I appreciate you as always also for making us a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. As always, if you see me, please say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how your mom and them. I trust you, that nation. I'll holla at you.